Hi there, Bonnie Violet here, and you're at Faith Leaders 2020. It's Wednesday afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at. And thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about the guest that we have. Also, feel free to leave comments or ask questions throughout the show. The show is going to run for about 45 minutes to an hour, so feel free to interact with us as we move through this conversation. So thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest this evening. Our guest is Rebecca Anderson, and Rebecca Anderson is a pastor at 2 churches in Chicago, one of which she started from scratch with a friend and a colleague. Her biscuits are unparalleled, and she knows the best place to pick Juneberries. She is the head honcho of Earshot, running storytelling workshops across the country. You can find Rebecca on Sunday mornings at Bethany, a progressive traditional church in Ravenswood, and Sunday evenings at Gilead, a queer storytelling bar church on Chicago's north side. She makes fires, plants gardens, and always certainly wants to have coffee with you. And here is Rebecca.
Hey.
Hi, Rebecca. How's it going?
Hi, everybody. Good. Pretty good, all things considered.
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, definitely. So I like to just jump right in. And I always like to start from hearing a little bit about, little Rebecca, or I'm not sure what you were called when you were young, but could you tell me a little bit about kind of like where you grew up and what life was like as a child?
Yeah, I did go by Rebecca when I was little. There was a brief period apparently where people got away with Becky, but never since.
Not anymore, huh?
No. So when I think about me as a kid, when I think about little Rebecca, like I think, sort of like 2nd grade to 4th grade age, that's sort of when I remember becoming the person that I am now in a funny way.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot of connection with me in like 4th grade. So my dad's a pastor. He's ordained in the Evangelical Free Church. And when I'm at that age that I picture myself at, little Rebecca, we lived in northern Michigan in Alpena, and he was the pastor of a Free Methodist church. And I loved all things church. It was like a very happy childhood, very happy growing up. It was a church that made my parents look like liberals, which at the time they were not. My mother was the first. It was very old school conservative, like a way that I don't even know anybody like this at this point in my life. My mother was the first pastor's wife, because of course there were only pastors' wives. She was the first pastor's wife to ever wear earrings or pants or makeup.
Oh wow!
So
scandalous.
It was like a whole different. Yeah, she was pretty scandalous. So, and I was the kind of kid, I was an oldest kid. I was a goody 2-shoes. I loved church on top of it. I could memorize Bible verses like nobody's business. And I loved it. I loved the stuff of church. And I was conservative. I was definitely, thought about how to witness about Jesus and like bring my, how to save my friends. So that was what life was like growing up. I mean, it was a church of, actually, I don't know, when you're a kid, how many, plus we sat in the front. I don't know how many people there were
How many people were behind you, right?
Right, but it was like a big church. We'd just say there were probably 150 people there, 175, I don't know. But churchy church, A-frame, sanctuary,
Right.
red carpet, stained glass behind the pulpit.
Mm.
And the thing that was true both there, and then we moved to Massachusetts when I was going into middle school. It's the way that for a preacher's kid is that the church is an extension of the house. So when we were kids, I remember like very specific games that took place all around the church building, and that place had a gym, and we're in and out of
Nice.
there. And then when I was a teenager, we had moved to Western Massachusetts, and there in New England, I mean, my folks were much, by contrast, were much more conservative than folks around necessarily,
Mm.
but lived in the church, did our homework there, used this bathroom there when the ones at home were full, put
Right,
extra
right.
stuff in the fridge. And I sang, when I appreciated having that sanctuary to myself to sing. So I was a
Mhm.
pretty devout kid. Um,
It sounds like you were surrounded by it, but you also loved it.
yeah, I really did. Um,
I
yeah.
was I actually started out in a Free Methodist church as well. And I was definitely that girl that, wanted to save everyone for Jesus. I remember one time like being really upset. I was like came home from church and I was crying with my mom and I was just like bawling and she's like, "What is wrong with you?" I'm like, "You're going to hell and like you're good people and I don't understand why you go to hell." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like,
Telling your mom you're good people.
well, you know what I mean? I was like, "You're a good person. I don't
Yeah.
understand." But, like it was just like she's like because they didn't go to church, and my understanding was that they didn't have a relationship with God, which
Mhm.
means that they weren't saved, which meant they were going to hell. And
Yeah.
in my little like understanding, and my mom was like, "How do you know I don't have a relationship with God? Like just because I don't go to church?" And I think that was the first time I ever got the idea that maybe there might be a different way.
Yeah. I mean, I was a much later bloomer theologically than you. I mean, I I sort of slid kind of sideways. I got to college and it was a very secular college, and conservative Christianity had stopped being appealing to me, but I wasn't exposed to any kind of progressive Christianity that was compelling to me.
Hmm.
And so I just, it's easy enough to stop going. And but somebody I met at college like had grown up in some progressive church, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, if I had grown up in Joel's family, our church would have marched in the Pride Parade." Like,
All right.
but I was like 22, you know what I mean? So I was like, "Oh, there are different kinds of Christians," but I felt like I was raised more tacitly than explicitly with a sense that like Christianity is like this wide, and it
Mhm.
looks like sort of checking all of these specific interpretations of the tenets of the faith. And if you don't check those boxes, then you're not a Christian.
Right.
Um,
And was it kind of more so like people coming into church rather than like going out of church, I guess? Like, I don't feel like I made a comment about there not being gay people at my church, but there might have been. But there wasn't, right? Like, so I think part of that, there wasn't like, wouldn't necessarily know what a gay pride parade is, but I wouldn't be going out to try to bring new Christians there either, if that makes sense.
you
Is that what
wouldn't
you're
be going
saying?
out to, well, I want to hear more about it so I make sure that I'm answering the right part of it. When you said you wouldn't be going there to bring Christians, you mean you wouldn't have gone?
I didn't even know what it was, to be honest. Like, uh,
Yeah.
and I don't remember church ever saying that being gay or being queer was bad. I just don't remember it being talked about. And it wasn't like you didn't have gay people in church. You didn't have gay people at the pulpit. It just wasn't talked about. I don't recall anyone ever saying you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. But everything was always this like man and woman, get married, have kids, for, save people for Jesus, that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
sexuality, I guess, never really came into that.
I had the same experience, and in my, at least the way I remember it, is that so there were no women in any kind of visible leadership in the
Mm.
churches where I grew up. And I don't think I realized how thorough that was until it was like I was visiting another church, and I mean, I can't even remember if this is what actually happened. I was at another church, And I don't think it was a particularly progressive church because I think it was like Women's Sunday or something, and they had women taking the offering or something.
Mhm.
And in seeing people do like sort of a serving role and realizing like, oh, I haven't ever even seen women doing that in our church.
Right.
And again, whether either of those memories are accurate, I don't know, but I don't remember like a lot of sermons about how women should be submissive or silent or, so it was like gender. There was an implicit gender binary for sure.
Yeah.
And I definitely learned that there were things that women did not do, but it's not like I remember a lot of sermons about how the roles that women should have and yeah, no, not very much conversation about human sexuality at all.
Mm-hmm.
That I remember.
Right. And so you're in college at 22. That's when you're starting to try out some different churches.
Well, so it's funny. I had this sense of myself, like I couldn't check the boxes, so there's this sort of 2-minute version of my spiritual autobiography or whatever. And it's
Right.
like, and I realized, I've often said with some sadness, that I was no longer a Christian or I couldn't be considered a Christian, whatever.
Yeah.
But
Were you aware of it?
Was I aware of it?
Yeah. Was that like a conscious kind of thought?
I think it was gradual and cumulative.
Mm.
I knew that I was no longer like practicing just because I had observed myself, but in college, I wrote a play about growing up evangelical, and I definitely understood myself as outside the church world at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Then after college, I sort of dipped my toe in a lot of different pools, and never really found a place that I landed. Although I think more than I remember. Like I think I went to an Episcopal church for 6 months or something, which is not nothing.
So
But
what did you
yeah,
what
go
did you
ahead.
go to school for? What did you study?
Uh, theater and agriculture,
All right.
which, I mean, it actually has absolutely made me the person I am. And I look back on some of the stuff I did in college and I think, oh, it's truly the exact same skill set I'm using now,
Right now.
especially in starting a church. So,
Yeah.
so it ended up being great.
Right. So when did I guess getting into when did you ever think about being a pastor? When did that come to mind?
Right. So I kicked around in my 20s, barista, gardener, nanny, after school programs, not part of faith communities, not for any long term. I ended up doing concurrently, they weren't related, but I ended up doing stand-up comedy and running an after school program in a Jewish day school. And Betsy in the chat says theater and agriculture is so on brand for me, which that is correct.
It's so true.
It's not
so true.
just that I studied them that I ended up that was sort of genetic almost. So I ended up doing comedy and running a program, after school program in this Jewish day school. And so being surrounded by people of practice at the school, and then making things happen in a room with the comics, like being privy to that all the time, like multiple nights a week. Out of those two communities, I felt like I was sort of primed by being part of those two communities. And a friend who's not religious, who had all the details wrong, said, if I were you, I would go check out this church. And like I said, my friend had all the details wrong neighborhood, wrong pastor, wrong everything. But it was a new church that turned out to be like a half mile from my house, and I was living in Boston. And I, people who've heard me tell this story, I tell it the same way because it was this moment that just had this huge impact on me, that I walked into this church, so I'm going inside and felt this sense of like that there was all of this space, and there was a capaciousness to the way the faith was expressed there. And it did not take me, it took me a while to become like a part of the community because I kind of hung back, but it didn't take me any time at all to to consider myself like in again. I
Right.
didn't have a big, it wasn't a big obstacle. Like when I came back and there was church with like, the head pastor was a woman and it was fully affirming of people of all genders, gender identity, sexual, it was one of those long progressive church welcomes where they list
Right.
everybody. And it wasn't hard for me. Like enough stuff had happened for me that I was like, oh, great. I guess all that other stuff was wrong. Like,
Right.
And it wasn't very long being part of that church. Kind of an embarrassingly short time before I was sitting in the pews and was like, oh, my 20s, my life has not been as eclectic and disconnected as I thought. Like this is the thing that I am trained for and that I think is important and that I want to do.
So you kind of saw a space in which you could exist as you were as an adult in kind of a similar space that you did as a child? Or was it completely different?
I think in some ways that's right. Like there's certainly a version of the story that's like I went into the family business and I found a way that I found a place where there was room for me. But in other ways it feels quite different. And I do think, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this given your theological path. There are ways where this is going to be a slight overstatement, but there are ways where Christianity, as I experience it now, feels theologically like almost a different faith from the Christianity of some of the folks that I grew up with, and I think sometimes it feels that way.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that is me saying that and how much of it is me thinking that they would think that
Right.
because of where I am. So I don't know if you've had any.
Well, and a part of it is it's just like I see things so much differently than I did, years ago. So it's, it's really hard to know, am I just seeing things that were there all along that I never noticed, or are there actually new things going on?
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably a combination of both.
Yeah, that's helpful.
One of the things that was helpful for me when I first came back into church was there had to be like enough familiar things that reminded me of what I grew up in, but kind of done now in which I could exist as I am, which so that it felt authentic. I felt like going to a gay, and there's nothing wrong with this, but there was this idea of going to a gay church for gay people. It didn't feel like, I don't know, it felt like it was made just special for us. And somehow it was like this thing off to the side instead of really just being the same thing. And so it was really important. I think it was really important for me that there were non-queer people, there were straight people, there were old people, that there weren't much kids, but, and because that's just reminded me of what the hymns, the music, that sort of stuff was similar to what I grew up with.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was big for me too. The church, my home church in Boston, which is called Hope Central now, it was a fresh, like I didn't have language for it at the time. I remember stumbling around and saying sort of asinine things like, it's a fresh take on, like it's new language with old forms. It's ancient, like I didn't know. And I think, I've said to you and I've said plenty in public that certainly my experience of church there, and definitely what I'm trying to do with church now, my experience of church then was that it was a fresh translation. And I didn't know or remember enough to think of the story of the day of Pentecost, where people heard the stories about God, like each in their own language. But looking back on it, that is truly the feeling I had. So I walked into this church and the feeling was that of like, oh my gosh, like I can understand what they're saying. And I think a thing that happens for a lot of people is that we go to church and we have to do the translation ourselves. Like we were talking about earlier, like which sort of normative for discussion of sexuality in church or whatever. But
Right.
so that if you're in a church where people are constantly saying like man and woman, there's sort of binary and there's heteronormativity and all that, people are sitting in the pews doing our own translation. Like, well, I guess in my case that would be, so we're doing our own translation. And I think that to be in a place where you don't have to do that translation, and it's already speaking your language, whether that's about gender identity or just a different expression, a different style of music that speaks to you more than the one, any number of things that just function as a different translation of the gospel. And my experience at my home church was like, it was like very traditional church in some ways. They talked a lot about Jesus, and that was important to me. Like, I was not compelled by Jesus as a good guy. Like, I was like, the world is full of good people. Like, that's fine. I'm not going to get up and go to church because of a good guy. So in some ways it was pretty traditional. It was very Christian, but it was this liveliness, this freshness that now I think of as a new translation that spoke to me. And so when I heard it, I got to feel that way you feel relaxed if you've been trying to speak a second or third language all day, and you're like, you just speak our language.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you can stop doing that mental gymnastics, you can actually just be present for the person next to you or what's being done, to where you're not having to always because that can make you feel like, well, is this where I need to be? Because you can feel seen. I think you feel seen or known when you're in a space that you don't have to do that.
Yeah. Like I'm included here. Because is this for me? If you're sitting there needing to do translation to make it for you,
right.
The implication is that it's not.
Yeah.
I think, I mentioned that like long progressive church style welcome that happened at my home church, which I do love to make fun of that kind of thing. I absolutely, I've done it, but I love to make fun of that kind of thing. But a thing that was really important is that in that welcome, welcome to old people, welcome to young people, welcome to, poor people, welcome to, just truly like every category. It was a long welcome. They said, welcome to single people. And you said earlier that it may not even have been about sexuality as it was about like the expectation, like you're going to get married and you're going to, there's just this sort of arc that people are on, and, you're in the singles, and then you're in the young marrieds, and then you're in the young parents class, and then there's just a trajectory, and that's never been my life. And so just to hear someone name it, I was like, oh, I guess these long, goofy welcomes are worth it, because great, I guess it is for me. They named me particularly. So
yeah, it's wild how that works, huh? It's like we fight to not have these labels on all of us because we don't want to get put into a box, but it's often these little labels that help us feel seen, help us feel connected, help us identify with other people so that we're not feeling so isolated and alone. It's wild.
Yeah.
So then how did you decide to become a pastor, or how long did you go there before that came into your mind?
Like you said, not very long. Yeah. I realized a few years ago that I talk about it the way, if you ever talk to somebody where they got like married or they moved in together, like after knowing each other a really short time, and there's sometimes like a little bit of sheepishness about it, but it's worked out, we moved in right away, but then now it's 10 years. It's great. And like, I went to that church, like, that's how I talk about it. I was like, it was soon. It was really fast. It was like 18 months, but it's working out. It's going well.
Right.
So it was truly not very long. I went there. The first Sunday I went there was a Mother's Day. And maybe I've even been lying to myself and saying it was a year and a half when it was even shorter. Maybe I went there for a year and a half.
You don't have to lie that it went quick.
I was like, oh, I've been telling this story all wrong. It did not take very long. So whether it was a year and a half or something like that, because then I ended up at I moved out here in 2007 for divinity school. So, and it was, so I had this sense of, whenever it was this very small moment of, listening to my pastor preach another like beautiful sermon, and just very small, quiet moment of,
Did you, when you got started, did you envision that you would have a bar church? Was that like one of the reasons why, like, because you still saw that church, did you want to still make church different, or did you feel like it was good?
I knew that what did I know? I suspected maybe that I wanted to make it possible for more people to have that like, experience that I had had. I think that happens. I think that every church is a translation of the gospel. It's not only work that New Church can do. I think it's necessary to have different translations of the gospel. And by translations, again, I just mean different communities, because some people, you can have a whole group of people who absolutely love a church and find it life-giving and beautiful, and someone else shows up and they're like,
this place is crap.
This is crap. The music sucks. You guys are kind of weird, or whatever the thing is. And that feels bad, but it also is like, oh, well, good news. There are like a gajillion other churches you can try. And so I knew, or I suspected, that I wanted to sort of be the kind of church where people could have that experience of like, oh, great. But again, lots of churches do that. So I came out here, and I was, I did my field placement. Like, I was a student pastor at a Methodist church that was another one of these sort of like traditional churches where things were like fresh. Trey Hall was the pastor, who I think you probably know.
Yep.
And Trey was on his way already. When I met him, he was feeling pulled, and then was sort of explicitly dreaming about what became Urban Village Church. And it looks like there are people from Holy Covenant who are at least here for a little bit. So I had come from New Church, and then I did my student pastor work with somebody who was like in the like fermenting stage, where he was like working on this thing, and he had that kind of vision and the dirty word evangelism. He had that kind of evangelistic impulse. And so by that point, I was pretty convinced. By the time probably by 2011, I knew that New Church was going to be in the mix for me. But I didn't know bar church.
What's that?
I didn't know it was going to be a bar church.
Right.
I didn't. Yeah. I think I thought it was going to be like, I know what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be like mason jars with wildflowers, and we were going to have like urban gardens, and it was going to be
that agriculture, right?
Yeah,
agriculture.
So I thought it was going to be this, I don't know, kinfolk situation, but so. Do you want to hear about how we came up with why it's a bar church now?
Yeah, sure. We can go ahead and jump right in.
Or is there something else? Because I was like, what should I say next?
I know, right? Well, I just kind of go with the flow. That's we're about like halfway through as far as time wise. So it's a great time to kind of pivot into kind of like where you're at now and what you're doing. So if you want to talk about that, that'd be great.
Sure. So after grad school, I ended up I was an associate pastor at a church in the northern suburbs. And there was quite a lot of work of translation there as well. I love those people, and they loved me, and many of them still do. And I am so grateful for my time there. And it was a work of translation. I mean, there were folks there who thought I was like an evangelical fundamentalist because I talked about Jesus, and there were people there who thought I was like a big old socialist, which is correct, because I talked about Jesus, so there was some work of translation that I learned to do there. that I think was really good for me, and I believe was good for that place as well. But even when I started at that church, I knew that there was a new church. So I had met my my co-pastor, Vince Amlin, when we were both in divinity school, and actually he had worked with Trey as well. And we were part of a clergy group that still travels together once a year. We pray for each other and cook great food and tell dirty jokes and sing hymns. And we talk about people who you can just like speak your own language with. They're beloved. So Vince and I got to know each other in that group, and I had this new church thing cooking, and I'm ordained Disciples of Christ, and the Oliver, hello, Oliver says in the chat that it's correct. Now I was going to read it so everyone could hear it, and I've already lost track of what I said. Anyway, thank you, Ollie. So I had this new church thing cooking in me. My denomination, the Disciples of Christ, had started to see potential in me and sort of equip me, send me to trainings and things to be a new church planter. And that at that point looked like it could play out a couple of different ways. I said to Vince on one of our sort of annual clergy retreats, you know, our friends were like still asleep, and Vince and I were like out on this deck in borrowed cabin in like St. Augustine or whatever. I think I say St. Augustine, but it's St. Augustine or whatever. And so we're out there with our coffee before other people got up, and I just said, what would it look like if we started a church? Like, I don't want to flirt with this idea. I don't want to. Can we swear on this?
Yeah, we can.
I said I was like, I don't want this to turn like a fuckboy situation where we have this like long distance flirtation about like, you know, like, oh, I miss you so much. I would love to see you. And then when it comes down to like, well, do you want to buy a ticket and come see me? It's like, oh, no, I can't do that. So it's like, I don't want to flirt. I don't want to flirt with this idea of a church. Like, let's talk about it for a while. And it's either like get it together or let it go, you know?
Right.
And I may have been thinking of a specific situation in my own life at that time, but I, you know, like, let's not do that.
Right.
So Vince and I went from being the kinds of friends who saw each other once a year, or like text each other about like prayers on the group thread or whatever, to people who texted every day, all day long. Like, here's this, he calls it our like nest building phase. Like, here's this, it's all these little things. Here's this poem. Here's this video about baptism. Here's, what do you think about this song? I saw this thing. Do you know this comic? Like just ideas, things that were meaningful and that felt like the work somehow. There was sort of a long and winding path to get from there to partnering with a denomination, but that's not that interesting. It was hairy, and then it turned out to be great after some very hairy parts. But so that initial phase, what would it look like if we did this? I think was all the way back in 2014. And there was a weekend in there where there were sort of 3 different encounters, you know, with people saying just one brief thing to me, someone else in our little clergy covenant group saying, you know, why would you plant a church any place but Chicago? You know, all those people there. And I was like, oh, that's right. You know, things like that, but just over the course of one weekend. And I called Vince and said, we never leave each other voicemails, but I left him a voicemail that was like, call me back. The Lord has given me a word.
Right. Was the word Chicago? Or?
And the word was that he should move to Chicago and we should start. So
did he was like, okay, I'll be right there.
I mean, like, way more had happened before this that I skipped, but he was like, yeah, let me talk to my spouse. Like, you know, okay.
Right.
Like, yeah, let me talk to my spouse. So, so in January of 2017, we were, so this is skipping a lot. In January of 2017, we were getting ready to have our first monthly worship service. And this is where the question of like, how do we become a bar church happened? So we had done all this work and raised all this money and been through all of this bullshit with denomination. And then we're sitting in our shared office and we're like, what happens at this church? Like, what's it like? Like, we have all of this, what's it like? But it's all this wide. And it's like, but what happens when we're together at church? And also, where does it happen? You know? We have like
Right.
no place, no idea about where we're going to meet. And what had emerged in like a big fundraiser that we did in the fall of 2016 was that storytelling was our core practice. It wasn't just one of our practices. It was our core practice. We tell true stories that save lives. And at every event.
Beyond like testimony, or just as in talking about the Bible and stories?
Yeah. So, yes, beyond that. So I don't use the word testimony either with Earshot stuff or at church because
it's this trigger word.
Because it's a trigger word. People know what it is and they love it. They know what it is and they hate it. And it definitely mentions God explicitly, and it definitely makes a point. And we tell stories that are, you can tell a story that we say every story is a God story. And that means whether or not it mentions God, you know, some people tell true stories from their lives organized around a theme that the service is built on. And somebody in the chat says, holy cow, have we been giving testimonies? Fear.
Sorry about that.
Gileadites.
Right. I think,
you know, when I teach storytelling, I say the reason that I don't call them testimonies, that people think that there's a shape. I once was lost and now I'm found, and then we sing Amazing Grace. And that a bunch of us have stories that are like, I once was lost. I'm still kind of a mess. I don't know what's going on. Let's sing Amazing Grace. Like that's, you know, where is the room for stories like that in church? And so we ask people to tell, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we ask people to tell true stories from their lives around a theme. And the theme is drawn from the scripture that we're preaching on that night. The scripture is drawn from the sermon series that we're in the middle of. And I can say more about that, but we had stories from the beginning. And while we were looking for a place to meet, we ended up in the back room of a restaurant. And shortly after that, we ended up at a big old Presbyterian church in Rogers Park, which was not for us for many reasons. And in the end, they didn't want us there either. So.
Right. They're like, no, we're good. You can go now.
I have a memory of us leaving that church, and Vince is like, they definitely kicked us out. I'm like, oh.
Right.
Sure, that's a way to tell that. So in any case, we ended up at a real shitty dive bar that we loved called Red Line Tap in Rogers Park on the far north side of Chicago that has since been torn down. Recently, we realized that almost every place we've ever met has closed. So probably people shouldn't write to us.
Was that like a theater too? Was Red Line a theater as well? Or did they do like dinner theater or something?
They used to have, so Red Line Tap was right next to Heartland Cafe. And there used to be a whole block there was like a little black box theater that was just, trying to think which direction, maybe like one doorfront north of Red Line Tap.
Okay.
I think I'm going in the right direction. So there used to be even more spaces that were all sort of interconnected. I'm not sure what was happening by the time we got there. It had changed hands a few times, and the owner who was there was this extremely generous, still is this extremely generous person who was like, well, why don't you come check out the bar? And
so are you just there on Sundays, or what's that look like?
Yeah, we were there on Sunday night, and we meet at 5:00 on Sundays, and it just right away felt like home. And we grew there, and it was like the right amount of shitty, and then it got too shitty for a while. There was like standing water in the bathrooms, and we're
wow.
Okay, it's pretty rough.
Right.
But that still suited us. So So we ended up there. And of course, as you might expect, a lot of folks, well, not a lot of folks. There are people who are a little bit trolly. They tend to be other Christians who are like, what about people who don't drink? And we're like, yeah, you're totally right. There are people here who are sober. And if people can't be around it, every other church in Chicago meets not in a bar.
Right, right.
Like, this is absolutely, actually, this became sort of a tagline. We're not for everyone.
Right, yeah.
We're not for everyone, but we might be for you, is what we say.
Yeah.
So
Well,
we place a high premium on specificity. What
right.
were you going to say?
No, I think that's a good thing to know, because I feel like there's like I guess the goal is to be so inclusive that everyone can be in the space, but the reality is it's the space isn't for everyone, and that's totally okay, because like you said, there's lots of other spaces. It's not like you need to have some. Not that there's anything wrong with the mega church, but it's not like you have to have this big mega church that everyone feels, and I'm sure everyone doesn't feel comfortable there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so grateful. There's this guy who started a church in Massachusetts called Simple Church, and he, like a lot of other people, graciously talked to me early on. I was one of those irritating, like, can I pick your brain for, and he was one of the people who generously said yes. And he scared me at the end of our phone call because he said, can I offer you some unsolicited advice? And I was like, I'm not really that interested.
Right.
Not really. No. But one of the things he said was, people will tell you or try to tell you that you're too like boutique, that you're too specific. But you have a vision, and it's particular, and it's for people who are particular, and you should just hold fast to it. It's so clear. The vision is so clear, and you should do it. You should do just the thing that you're called to, because somebody else is doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so glad I didn't hang up on him.
Right. And how has doing church been impacted in 2020 with COVID? How has that impacted church?
Yeah, hugely. We've been doggedly analog kind of all along. We've sort of refused to stream stuff, even when there are good reasons to stream stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much you have to be there kind of place. Like, it's what happens in the room. And we talk a lot about bodies and incarnation, and it's just what it is. It's like if you miss it, you miss it. It's just an in the room phenomenon. Mm-hmm. We also place a high premium on parties. We have a big emphasis on we changed our core practices to include that we throw great parties and make real friends. And so pandemic.
Right. Yeah. How are you going to throw a party?
Yeah. How are you going to throw a party? So like everybody else, we went online, and we have tried a lot of different ways. Tried, meaning we've done church a lot of different ways. One thing that was instructive in the early pandemic is that we did a sermon series. Normally we do like 3 or 4 week sermon series, and this sermon series stretched to be like 8 or 10 weeks because we had no end date on it. And it was called No Time Like the Present. And we rolled out all these ideas that we thought that we'd had for a while, but thought were too weird, or like we couldn't justify them. And then we were like, it's a fucking pandemic. We can do whatever we want. Right. And like, so there was like a puppet service and a hedgehog service. And we took communion around to people and served it distant, outside their houses, and filmed that. And we did a church variety show, So we still were trying to do things that were, definitely specific for particular people. We were trying to do things that were delightful. And in some ways it's an easy time to do things that are delightful because there's so little that is. And in another way, it's a really hard time to do things that are delightful because everything's so shitty. but we doubled down on some of that stuff. Over the summer, we were able to meet outside
Mm-hmm.
with all of the precautions and safety things you would hope for. And that allowed us to be together in person. But it has meant that we've kind of lagged behind in figuring out tech, because in the early, we were just like, well, we'll pray together over Zoom, and here's a video of some great stuff.
Right.
So then we had to figure out sort of live worship together later. And we're still getting better at that.
And then and then as you're dealing with COVID, then we start having, I guess, would we label racial unrest in response to an awareness, a more broader awareness of police brutality. How I know for me, I was really challenged in like, how do I respond? What do I do? I too was like coming to see things that I hadn't saw before and felt like a total ass, you know? But also there were like I remember not being sure what to do and who to listen to on how to respond, and kind of like, okay, my thought was, well, what do I do as a spiritual person, as a person who has God in her life? Like, how would you want to respond, or what do you want to do, rather than kind of being reactive to everything? How has this impacted your church at all, or your congregation, and how have you responded to it, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is that I really resonate with that experience of not knowing who to listen to, and feeling overwhelmed by all of the voices, and sort of the echo chamber of my social media, which is like full of progressive clergy who are like,
performative, or
I don't know what they are. I did not find the multiplicity of voices to be helpful. That's what I'll say. No, I don't think they're performative. I think they're doing the work, but I think that didn't help me do my work, you know. And like, glad I took even a second to realize that, you know, there are people at Gilead who, many people who have long been about the work of anti-racism and working on their own stuff, and working as activists, and in a way, and you asked about the congregation, not about me, but it was
either way, yeah.
It was grounding to remember, the ways in which I have been about the work, at the same time as remembering, reckoning with how far I have to go. To remember the fact that, as with the congregation, I'm not called to do all the things. I couldn't. No one could. And, you know, that there were people in the congregation who I looked to, and in some cases, like, asked specifically for their wisdom in the work that they had done. Because I felt buffeted, you know, like I just was, I was grief stricken and enraged, as I have been for a long, long time, about the police. So it wasn't a new feeling to me, but I did get kind of sucked into the vortex of what to do. And it's like, well, actually, I have been doing some things for quite a long time. So now I need to like stay grounded and like listen to wise voices about what's next, and where I need to grow, which, you know, significant areas that I have to have work to do still. And the congregation, as people who, some of whom felt the same way that I did, some of whom are like, yeah, we've been working on it, we know. It affected, absolutely, of course, affected people individually, and it's hard to, I don't know how to answer about how it affected us collectively.
Yeah, that's real. I can relate to that as well. I think I too was reminded, like, no, girl, you have done some of the work. Yeah, you do have more to do, especially when it was like starting to talk with old family members, or like I took a moment where like I did a walk and talk where I got on live and I just talked about whiteness, because I'd never really like talked about my whiteness. You know, I didn't even know I was white really until I moved to Chicago. Like, I didn't know what came with all of that until I moved to Chicago, and realizing that there was so much placed on me because of just how I appeared that I never was aware of before.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? So where is the best place to pick Juneberries?
There are multiple.
Can you tell?
Yeah, they're everywhere. It's a great pastime because you can stand in public and like pick things off a tree and eat them, and then other people walk by and say, "Is that edible?" You're like,
I just ate it.
hardcore. You're like, yes, definitely. So there are trees around the neighborhood that if you feel bold enough, you can like just go pick in someone's yard, like where the tree comes over the sidewalk. So I live near Clark and Foster in Chicago. And if you follow Foster to the lake, there's some great Juneberry trees south of Foster and west of Lakeshore Drive. There used to be some great ones at the Berwyn underpass, but one of them has been, I don't know, damaged perhaps by road salt. It's a great sense of loss that I have about it. There's a really great one down by the bathrooms just at the north end of Montrose Beach. So I've got a catalog, you know. Right. I know where to get Juneberries. And they're planted, I'm such a nerd. They're planted as decorative trees, but it is actually something you can eat. And in Canada, they're cultivated. That's something I always tell passersby, as if they already couldn't tell I'm a huge nerd.
Right.
It's a cultivar. Like, no.
They're like, great, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
I've been wondering about that for a while now.
Yeah, so glad to find out.
Right. And we're kind of running up on the end of time. Is there anything else you'd like to share that's going on with church or? I recall something about, do you guys have a beer, like your own beer or something?
Yeah, so we also didn't expect to be a beer brewing church. There's a question in the comments, someone wanting to know if Juneberries are the same as mulberries. No, friends, they are not. Mulberries are the ones that look like blackberries and they stain your sidewalks. Juneberries are smooth and they look like blueberries. We didn't start out to be a beer brewing church. Someone on our launch team pitched the idea. They said, my family has money that we could give and we're happy to do that. But I also have an idea about beer. We were like, bring it. What is the idea? And the idea was that if we brewed beer and had a beer release party and put it out to the media, that maybe we could get the word out about our church. And we, at that point, I mean, that was super early on. And we released that first beer, I think before our third ever church service.
So definitely pre-COVID.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. St. Patrick's Day, 2017. And part of it is, like we make our own shit. We believe in good news that feels like good news, which does not have to involve alcohol, but there is like, kind of a conviviality, a shared bottle of, tea or booze or whatever. And it did work very well at getting the news out. It garnered a lot of attention and that was really helpful. And
so is it available all the time or just?
No. So normally what we do is we partner with some brewer, home brewer, or this year a commercial brewer, which was fun. We make a beer, we have a big party, we get live music. You can buy a ticket to the party that comes with, a couple of pours and like a 4-pack if you want to get that, all this. So it's big event, stories, none of that this year, obviously. This year, we realized we could brew beer anyway, but we would have to just sort of distribute it in a small way. So we had, we brewed Advent beer worth waiting for. We talked about it as an Advent wreath, which was very confusing to people because the wreath was made of beer. No matter how many times we said, is it a wreath or is it beer? It's beer. People were like, oh, where's the wreath part? We're like, it's beer. So we made a beer and we gave it away outside with our masks on and standing apart last Wednesday night around a fire while somebody played accordion. It was beautiful and weird and so great to see people. And so it's not available all the time, but we actually do have some beer that's left mostly for pickup in Chicago. But if you go to the website and look for the place where it says "Get your Advent wreath,"
Right.
it's beer. It's beer, you guys.
Yeah, and I think I had your a way that they can get connected with Gilead is through Instagram. Is that a good way to do it?
Yeah. Yep. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Gilead Chicago. Yeah, but Insta is a great way.
All right, fantastic. All right, so what there was something else I was going to say and it went right out of my head. But thank you so much for doing the show tonight. Is there anything else you would still like to say that you haven't said yet before we say goodbye?
I'm such a talker. I can't imagine. It's so good to see you. I don't get to see enough of you. And I appreciate this time, and I'm grateful for you and the work that you do in the world, and I'm glad for this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. I was so glad that you said yes. And yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours, for hours. And for folks who maybe are watching or coming across this, this show, Faith Leaders 2020, will be live every Wednesday through the rest of the year at 3:33 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. One of the guests that is going to be in a couple months is Trey Hall, actually, who's now in the UK. And then next week, I will have Jonah, who's in Milwaukee, and Cameron. They're pastor and co-pastor. I'm totally messing up their titles, but they one of the things I love about virtual church is like on Sunday I go to like 4 or 5 different like church services, and Zao MKE is like one of my favorites. So I'm really excited to have them come on the show next week. Again, that's at 3:33 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you want to get more connected with the Queer Chaplain, I interview drag queens, trans folks, and we talk about sex and spirituality and all that fun stuff. The big key is just to help people see that we can exist as who we are, as people who were told or thought or believed that we didn't have access to a God or spirituality, and that's bullshit. And and sometimes I know I lacked the imagination to know that that was possible myself for a really long time. And so my hope is to help spark people's, just to spark something in people to so they can seek and explore, because I believe spirituality has just increased my capacity to live life in a way that I was meant to. And like, the queerer I become, the closer I get to God and the more I seek it. So I do have a tap link you can click to, and it'll take you to all the different podcasts. I have a podcast with my aunt called Splintered Grace. We didn't talk for over 20 years because of religion, and we kind of got back together because of spirituality. And so it's a really great thing. A lot of people are choosing not to sit at the table with family members, and we're intentionally trying to do that and share with people about what that's like. So I will stop rambling on and on and on. But again, thank you so much.
Picture that. I know you're closing out, but I've been listening to that podcast and it's so great. I really love it. So thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. Yeah. And if folks are podcast fans, you can listen to Splintered Grace on anywhere you listen to podcasts. So you can even scream at Alexa and say, "Hey, Alexa, play Splintered Grace podcast," and it'll come up for you. So yeah, we just have one more episode this season. And then we'll start again doing live in probably the end of January, beginning of February. All right. Well, thanks again so much, Rebecca. Thanks everyone who joined us tonight. And take care until next week. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I have like a little outro I'll play. And here we go. Wrong one. Oops. Just joking.